The history of Australian rail means that there are 3 gauges for the tracks: narrow gauge, standard gauge and broad gauge, or sometimes the Irish gauge. South Australia has got much of its broad gauge track converted to standard gauge, with a small section of dual gauge between Dry Creek and Port Adelaide. In Western Australia, where the original rail was narrow gauge, much of it is now standard gauge. But interestingly, there is 207 kilometres of dual gauge. So the question is, how can a rail system handle different gauges? One way is to have dual gauge, another one is to have gauge changing trains. In Europe, the rail lines on the continent are standard gauge, except for Iberia, Spain, which has got broad gauge, and Russia and Finland, which are also broad gauge, but a different broad gauge. This is showing a system on the border with Germany and Russia using a Spanish system of changing the gauge of the trains themselves. You can see that the cage is lifted up and the bogies are brought so that the wheels move in and out depending upon whether it's going from broad gauge to standard gauge or in the reverse. You can see that the train can go through at a quite reasonable speed, and the passengers do not have to get out of the trains, and the train just continues to move. This kind of technology occurs on the border of Spain and France and Poland and Russia. You can see here that the system is being lifted up and the wheels are being brought to a different gauge. This is the North Line at Parafield station. In the history of the North Line from Adelaide to the northern parts of South Australia was that all freight and passenger trains travelled on these 2 tracks. In the 1980s, when it was decided that Australia should standardise its rail with the standard gauge, South Australia organised for the building of a separate track which was standard gauge parallel to the existing broad gauge. This meant that the freight trains could go through without any interaction with passenger trains, but had the disadvantage that people living further afield from the metropolitan area of Adelaide were kind of disenfranchised because the South Australian government handed over inter-regional passenger trains to the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth hasn't brought trains from Adelaide to Port Pirie in recent times. So this line here is actually 3 tracks, 2 tracks of broad gauge and 1 track of standard gauge to this point, this junction here, just past Salisbury Station. This continues on as the old broad gauge. This section now is only a single track of standard gauge. It's suggested that if we wish to have trains being able to go to the regions, that the rail conversion trains, as seen in Spain and Russia interfacing with Europe, is a solution. If we want to get trains to be able to go to regional cities such as Port Pirie and Whyalla and Port Augusta, that we would have retention of these two gauges of trains, but having gauge changing trains as the solution to be able to bring people from the centres of each of these cities into the centre of the Adelaide city. There's no point having stations like the Adelaide Parkland station, which are out in the middle of nowhere, in relationship to where people want to get on and off their train. This is showing a system on the border with Germany and Russia using a Spanish system of changing the gauge of the trains themselves. You can see that the cage is lifted up and the bogies are brought so that the wheels move in and out depending upon whether it's going from broad gauge to standard gauge or in the reverse.